Starmie used to be one of the best, most popular and defining Pokemon in all of generations 4, 5, and 6. However, if you kept up with any of those metagames in the past couple years, you know that it has fallen off hard, and it's now a far cry from what it once was. Whereas before it was a dominant metagame force you saw used constantly, and with seemingly impossible to stop consistency in battle. It is now used much less commonly and struggles to impact games with the same regularity and force of its glory years. This is not to say now Starmie is a bad Pokemon, mind you. Far from it. In fact, we'll mention how this Pokemon has remained useful in these metagames. It's just that any drop from Elite status, especially in Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, is a notable one worth examining. Coincidentally, while this has happened, Starmie has only gotten better in all of generations 1, 2, and 3. Before we get into the specifics of each generation, we must first identify the common factor between all three of DPP, Black and White, and ORAS. All of these metagames are powerfully, significantly influenced by spikes, and of course, Stealth Rock is relevant for more than just Rock-weak Pokemon, though those are obviously the most affected. Thus, Starmie's place in the metagame was simple, yet effective and important. It has Rapid Spin to deal with these entry hazards, and was a crucial Pokemon behind that, with an amazing speed stat, phenomenal longevity between Recover and Natural Cure, and good defensive typing alongside decent bulk. It also started becoming popular because of its naturally excellent matchup against one of the best, most popular Stealth Rockers, Heatran. As a result of these traits being well tailored to each of the three specific metagames in their own ways and the importance of dealing with oft overwhelming hazards, Starmie was incredibly popular for its reliability in handling such an important task. So what happened? Well, Starmie's weak points were significant as well, and each metagame capitalized on them. Its primary vulnerability was Pursuit, and thus, just like Starmie sat on Heatran in all three metas, the amazing Choice Scarf Tyranitar trapped Starmie in all three metas. That was far and away Starmie's most pressing exploitable issue. Furthermore, each metagame eventually shifted away from a focus on removing hazards in favor of ignoring hazards altogether, which was a much more reliable, robust way of dealing with such a powerful, oppressing strategy. Starmie lacked the longevity to go the distance against such teams in all three generations, and thus found itself becoming dead weight quite often. However, each generation also brought its own unique challenges for the Starfish, which we will examine now. In Generation 4, Starmie perfectly capitalized on the post-Dragons metagame. Tyranitar had stopped running Choice Scarf after Latias's ban, and was commonly running Dragon Dance after Salamance's ban. The most popular Pokemon in usage was Heatran, and its most popular set was a Shuka-Berry Stealth Rocker whose only way of seriously threatening Starmie was Explosion. Many such teams anchoring on this Heatran set had absolutely no way of keeping rocks up against Starmie. The same was true for another common Stealth Rocker, Metagross. Teams with Ghosts weren't safe either. Rotom Appliances took heavy damage from Hydro Pump, and Gengar got absolutely destroyed. Having such a fast, offensively capable Pokemon with Rapid Spin was excellent for enabling several of OU's Stealth Rock weak threats, such as Zapdos. Furthermore, Starmie's defensive capabilities beyond Rapid Spin were quite valuable. It was most notably a superb check to Infernape and a tremendous counter to Dragon Dance Gyarados. Starmie was phenomenal on all sorts of teams, from offense to hard stall, and shaped the metagame around it. It was one of the most commonly used Pokemon, and seemingly always did its job. So what happened? Well, number one, Scarf Tyranitar came back in a major way once players realized it was still immensely valuable even without Latias around, especially with Starmie being as excellent as it was. Of course, Starmie actually enjoyed partnering up with Scarf Tyranitar itself, as Tyranitar also liked pursuing Rotom forms, which made it easier for Starmie to Rapid Spin. Tyranitar's pursuing of Gengar also allowed Starmie to drop almost all of its speed and begin running a bold set. With the added defense, it was much harder for opposing Scarf Tyranitar to safely trap it, giving Starmie a ton of leeway in its most important one-on-one matchup. It even sometimes ran Reflect to become even more unbreakable on the physical side. Bold Starmie could even live a Heatran's explosion. Now, Scarf Tyranitar's return in and of itself wasn't a killer, far from it. Starmie continued to thrive and define the metagame for a long time afterwards. It was more that it marked the beginning of the metagame's adaptation to Starmie. This adaptation was slower at first, but still significant. Common Stealth Rockers shifted to those that could handle Starmie at least decently. Heatran began running Passion Berry and Hidden Power Grass. Swampert returned from the semi-hiatus it had been on since Grass-type uses had exploded in the wake of the Latimense bans. Both specially offensive and bulkier physical attacking Rock Jirachi sets became popular. Stealth Rock Blissey started popping up even on more offensive teams, and Tyranitar became an incredibly popular Stealth Rocker as well. One of Tyranitar's most common items on rock sets and general utility sets with Pursuit alike became Passion Berry. It of course had several other fantastic applications, most notably allowing it to check the terrifying agility in Polion, but by and large its biggest use was allowing it to more reliably handle Starmie, which you could never be too safe against back then. It's also why Roseway was such a popular spiker. Starmie would not want to immediately come in on it as it would against Skarmory. Still, in spite of these issues, Starmie was great. It was just exploitable if over-relied on, and was the norm for many players. They found it difficult to use teams without Starmie, which was telling of its metagame impact in its own right, and they also found it difficult to not use Starmie to try and answer everything. It was as if they had gotten accustomed to playing without Stealth Rocks on the field with Starmie's early excellence, so they'd throw it into everything and try to keep rocks off at all costs. This was incredibly easy to take advantage of. If you over-relied on Starmie, both overtly hinging on it in a team builder and spamming it too freely in battle, you get removed early in the game by Tyranitar. Then rocks would go up and you get swept by Agility Metagross, Trick Room Bronzong, Scarf Heatran, or what have you, such as the aforementioned Infernape or Gyarados. That was a player issue more than a Starmie issue though. Before Starmie fell off, it was still an excellent metagame force in spite of the adaptation going on against it if used right. It fell off though because the metagame had adapted to such an extent there was little Starmie could do to the newly strong popular teams with the sets it had been relying on for so long, both offensive and defensive. What were these newly strong popular teams? Earlier we mentioned teams that preferred to ignore hazards than remove them. Stall teams hinging on Starmie were powerful for a long time, but if Starmie wasn't able to remove hazards, they often crumpled under their pressure. Players were frustrated with how much of the game hinged on the dance of Starmie versus Ghost and Pursuit, so they instead started building teams that were able to last long even in the face of entry hazards. This was made especially doable with how good Clefable had been discovered to be. Stealth Rock Clefable, by the way, was another rocker that Starmie couldn't deal with at all. These teams already completely devoured Starmie with their aggressive use of Tyranitar and Rotom, to say nothing of how they could outlast it with Clefable if they chose so, and then just got better with the return of Latias to the tier. The era of slapping Starmie on every team was over. So what happened with Starmie? Make no mistake, it's still great. Its bulky set remains excellent on paralysis spam teams where Starmie itself is a solid paralysis spreader, where its defensive utility isn't meant to last forever, just long enough to withstand the opposition until Machamp and Jirachi are ready and positioned to destroy them. Choice Spec Starmie also became incredibly popular. Rather than going all in on Rapid Spin, it maximizes its offensive threat capability, smashing through the opponent with powerful Hydro Pumps. It can also ruin defensive teams with Trick. If it likes, it can fit in Rapid Spin, and of course the hazard relief can be great. However, it's used more as a wall breaker that can spin and not something whose spin is to be relied on at all costs as it was before. It is much more reliable at blasting through the opponent's defenses. In Generation 5, it was a similar story for Starmie. Yeah, Ferrothorn was everywhere, but Starmie had gained Scald, and once it got that burn, Ferrothorn was toast. Bulky Starmie was a scourge of rain stall teams in particular. It almost single-handedly knocked them out of viability with how hard it sat on them, while continuing to be a reliable rock remover against the ever-popular Heatran. It was also a massive pain for Deoxys Hyper Offense teams, since they were so scary because of their hazards, and they relied on Gengar as a spin blocker. Sure, Gengar was pretty good against Tentacruel and Fortress, but it was outrun and destroyed by Starmie's Psyshock. Many popular Starmie teams structured mirrored Gens 4s, what with the Heatran and Skarmories and Gliscors and Celebes and Scarf Tyranitars. Yeah, Scarf Tyranitar was still around and irritating, but it also worked for Starmie, since it helped remove the excellent new spin blocker, Jellicent, who was otherwise a massive pain for Starmie to deal with. Plus with Scald, Starmie could threaten Scarf Tyranitar even more than before. Meanwhile on Rain teams, Starmie's offensive capabilities were massive, with Life Orb and Drizzle boosted Hydro Pumps drowning nearly everything. Its strong thunders also smashed through Jellicent. Come Black and White 2, Starmie also gained Analytic, which made it hit even harder on the Switch. This made it popular on weatherless offense teams as well, which loved using its spinning tactics to enable Volcarona and Multiscale Dragonite against Stealth Rock. Plus, Starmie was one of the few Pokemon to resist Keldeo's stab and outspeed it, giving it a key role as one of the metagame's checks to the arguably broken horse. However, what eventually happened in Generation 4 had already been happening for years in Generation 5. With the immense power of Magic Guard, Reuniclus, and Alakazam, players realized it was easier to ignore hazards than to try and remove them, especially since it was easy to decide that Starmie would not spin if you didn't want it to. There was simply no way for Starmie to get past the popular combination of Jellicent and Scarf Tyranitar. Even if you ran an offensive set that could break past Jellicent, hazards were so strong that it was well worth sacking Jellicent so Tyranitar could follow up with the Pursuit Trap and guarantee that they would stay up. Even without Jellicent, these teams had no issue devouring Starmie. Running Starmie became a liability. The impossibility of spinning is the entire reason Excadrill was unbanned. However, even with Excadrill around, teams that stacked spikes and spike immunities were the most dominant around, and thus bulky Starmie ceased to have a place in the metagame. Starmie itself still has a place in Generation 5 though. The most immediately apparent is on those hyper-offensive teams, where it's effectively a spin machine. It sometimes even runs Air Balloon to provide it another opportunity to switch in and remove those hazards. It doesn't need to go the distance, it just needs to enable Volcarona and Dragonite Sweep. However, also like in Generation 4, a new way of using Starmie emerged that focused less on its spinning and more on its capabilities as an offensive Pokemon. It used to be that way you use either Tentacruel or Starmie as your spinner on Rain. Then players realized that Tentacruel was way too good not to use, and Starmie disappeared from Rain. Then players realized that you could use both Starmie and Tentacruel. Tentacruel would handle spinning duties as it did so well, and this left Starmie free to focus on its massive offensive threat potential. Once again running Choice Specs, which was utterly obscene under Rain. Starmie effectively took the role of Choice Specs Keldeo, except it was crucially faster than Latios, Rain Team's greatest enemy. Trick was also an amazing tool because it indiscriminately ruined whichever bulky wall the opponent had. Once again, Starmie unlocked its potential when it was used as more than a spin machine. Generation 6 first didn't see much of Spikes or Stealth Rock, since theoretically, Defog nullified the viability of both of those, right? Eventually that was proved to be nonsense, mostly because the defoggers were terrible and Spikes started becoming popular, especially in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. This is where Starmie once again showed its stuff. It not only removed these spikes, but it also allowed its team to remove opposing spikes while maintaining their own, unlike Defog. Of course, it once again had a superb matchup against the ever-popular Stealth Rock Heatran. Also, its ability to keep Keldeo in check was incredibly important in a meta where Specs Keldeo was one of the most dominant threats, seemingly impossible to stop safely. As such, Starmie became a fixture of the spike stacking ORAS metagame. It also, once again, had to contend with Scarf Tyranitar, but that was nothing new. Sometimes Starmie even ran Reflect type, both to avoid Tyranitar's pursuits and also to be able to beat Ferrothorn 1v1. Starmie's prominence and reliability in spinning prompted some players to begin using Jellicent. Spin blocking had previously been dismissed as a thing of the past by virtue of Defog, but since that was very much not the case anymore, Jellicent came back in a major way, completely shutting Starmie down. Jellicent's appearance prompted a shift once again towards teams that focused on stacking their own hazards and ignoring the opponents. These teams were especially excellent since they now boasted the metagame king, the newly fairy type Clefable, as well as the option of a newly fierce spike ignoring spikes abuser in Mega Latias. It was far easier and more consistent to run such teams than those which hinged on Starmie to remove rocks for threats severely affected by them, like Talonflame. Scarf Tyranitar was also sometimes swapped out for Choice Band Weavile, which was even more effective at pursuing Starmie. Eventually, Rapid Spin became an option again, but it wasn't from Starmie, it was from Excadrill, which was a much more reliable metagame pick not just for its lack of pursuit weakness, but also by virtue of its outstanding matchup against Clefable, which was incidentally a popular stealth rocker Starmie could not handle reliably. Unlike the other two generations, this time around, Specs Starmie didn't make waves for focusing on its own offensive threat capabilities rather than spinning. It didn't fit on offensive structures as well. Its place in the metagame is not completely displaced, but it's harder to fit than ever before. Starmie's fall in Generation 4 through 6 is a testament to the power of entry hazards, and how much more reliable it is to structure a team around not caring how many of them are on the field, rather than relying on getting rid of them in order to be able to function at all. It's interesting to see how much better it is as a Pokemon when it's focused on its own capabilities and not just a cog in the spin game. Incidentally, this is strongly related to why it's as good as it is in the first few generations. In Generation 2, it even had a similar arc. It was previously thought of as just a spinner, then came out with an offensive substitute nightmare set that turned the metagame on its head. All in all, Starmie is great. It's just important to remember that it's not just a rapid spin machine. If you did enjoy this video, please let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. My end of the year goal is 400,000 subscribers, and also check out my previous discussion video on why Landorus is the greatest Pokemon.